I'd like to introduce David Getsy. David is the Goldabelle McComb Finn Distinguished Chair in Art History at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's the author of Rodin, Sex and the Making of Modern Sculpture and Body Doubles, Sculpture in Britain, 1877 to 1905. And he's also the editor of the anthologies From Diversion to Subversion, Games, Play, and 20th Century Art, and Sculpture and the Pursuit of the Modern Ideal in Britain. His articles and essays include discussions of gender and sexuality in the work of Ernesto Pujol, Addington Simmons, Auguste Rodin, Alberto Giacometti, and of course John Chamberlain, and he's currently writing a book on gender assignment in post-war art entitled Abstract Bodies in American Sculpture, 1964 to 1976.
Hi. I want to say first off that this is a compression of a very large chapter of the book, and so unfortunately for time constraints, I'm going to give the early performance art of Burton some really short shrift. So there's a lot more to be said, and I go through it very, very quickly. Well, I teach in a museum school, and I regularly take my classes to discuss the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago. I remember once, during a session on post-minimalism, my class was discussing a Bruce Nauman work hanging on a wall. There was one bench in the room, and students packed themselves onto it during our long conversation. None knew that they sat on Scott Burton's low-piece bench while they were focused on Nauman's neon sign. When I turned to them and asked them how the Nauman might relate to the other sculpture in the room, students suddenly realized they were sitting on art, and they leapt from the bench as if it had been suddenly electrified. More importantly, however, they then looked at the sculpture, grounded themselves from this shock, and sat back down for the rest of the conversation about it. The low piece might have been art, but that recognition did not inhibit them from using it, though they now did so with a sense of collusion and satisfaction. As I will argue, my students were, in the end, giving Burton what he wanted. Burton became a successful public artist in the 1980s, creating major and often used installations, such as those at Battery Park or the Equitable Center in New York. These works often go unrecognized by viewers as art and are quite readily accepted and overlooked as part of the urban environment. Stylized and unassuming, his sculptures also occupy interior spaces, such as the Wiesner Building at MIT, with few knowing or caring that these are so-called autograph works by an artist. Museums, too, have welcomed Burton's work into their spaces and grounds. His work's popularity, in fact, has steadily grown since his death in 1989, as museums have increasingly concerned themselves with the participation of viewers and publics. His furniture is art, and its solicitousness of the viewer's activation have secured Burton's place in the Museum of Modern Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the National Gallery, and many other institutions, including being installed in the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden at the White House during the Clinton administration. This pattern has increased in recent years as Burton's priorities become increasingly legible against developments of modes of public practice and relational aesthetics. Now, in what follows, I want to take seriously this artistic practice in which Burton has created works that deliberately incite disregard, denigration, and subservience. Why is it, in other words, that my otherwise attentive and engaged art students could first overlook and eventually just use Burton's work? How is it that most of the users of Burton's sculpture, such as in Battery Park or in Midtown Manhattan, might never know that this was art at all? Burton knew quite well that his public objects would be largely overlooked and innocuous. In an unpublished 1985 interview, for instance, he remarked, quote, "There's a certain perverse pleasure in the idea that people may not even think that my sculpture is one of the exhibits at all," unquote. Burton's mode of practice, in other words, was self-effacing in its status as art and made itself available to serve the user. In asking to be used, these sculptures circumvent the respect and distance often given to the art object. Instead, they rely on a self-denial of the importance of the art object and of the artist who made them. This apparent self-abnegation and submissiveness were the foundations of Burton's artistic practice and were, I contend, both strategic and consistent. Well, throughout the 1960s, Burton's ambition was not to be an artist, but to be a writer. In addition to stabs at poetry, playwriting, and novels, he also wrote for dance, including the libretto for an experimental ballet created for an Aaron Copland composition staged by the New York City Ballet in 1965. Much of his writing was unsuccessful, few of his plays were produced, and that ballet was almost universally panned by the critics. It was only in art criticism where he found any degree of success, and he regularly contributed to Art News and then to Art in America. Most significantly, Burton wrote the introduction for the catalog to the pivotal exhibition of conceptual art titled When Attitudes Become Form in 1969. By the early 70s, he had secured his identity as a writer enough for his friend Sylvia Slay to include him alongside other art critics such as Lawrence Alloway and Carter Ratcliffe in her important feminist painting, The Turkish Bath. In 1973, he became an editor for Art in America. In his art critical writing of this decade, of the 60s, Burton increasingly concerned himself with sculpture. In particular, he engaged directly with the debates around the emergence of minimalism as an art historical category during the period. Burton's criticism was energized, in particular, in response to Michael Fried's famous attack on it in the 1967 essay, Art and Objecthood. And I show some notes from the archive of his reading of Fried. Burton's reading of this now famous essay was filtered through his own background in theater and dance, and he came to disagree with Fried's assault on minimalism's tactics of boredom and literalism, what Fried called its theatricality. By contrast, Burton valorized this term of denigration used by Fried, turning it into a positive trait to be developed. That is, it became an aim of Burton's to counter Fried's already infamous claim that, quote, the literal espousal of objecthood amounts to nothing other than a plea for a new genre of theater, and the theater is now the negation of art, unquote. Burton's defense of theatricality Burton's defense of theatricality led him to conceive of a new direction for himself, this time as an artist. He emerged from the art critical debates around minimalism and theatricality with the aim to develop a new mode of artistic practice, that of performance art, in which he sought to recuperate theater and fuse it with sculpture. In an artist statement written in 1973, he summed up his ideas saying, quote, performance is, most essentially defined, sculpture as theater. By theater is meant simply art in time, whatever is offered sequentially, that is not music or dance or drama. Performance is in medium, a form of theater, but in category, a form of sculpture, unquote. Burton was part of the group of artists such as Vito Acconci and Marjorie Strider, who developed street works in 1969. From these early performances, he developed a gallery-based performance practice that he called his tableau, in which a single performer or group slowly adopted poses and gestures, with as many as 80 individual scenes separated by blackouts. These works took on the idea of minimalism's simplified and repeated unit, but made that unit the human body. The aim of these performances was to focus viewers' attention on the subtle language of gesture and bodily communication. He stated, quote, in the behavior tableau, what I want people to become aware of is the emotional nature of the number of inches between them, unquote. The audiences would be kept at a great distance from the performers, usually some 50 to 80 feet, and would be forced to watch slow or still scenes performed one after the other with no musical accompaniment or any sound. The performers were dressed alike. They had their faces painted white to stress sameness, and of course made no sound, and moved slowly and deliberately. This is an incredibly complex set of performance practices that I'm summarizing in one paragraph, and I'm just saying there's a lot more that I'm not talking about with them, and they're really incredibly interesting and hardly documented. But I'm going to move perpendicularly from them, because while he was using his performers' bodies as objects to be combined in different configurations, he also began to treat actual objects, specifically pieces of furniture, as if they were human bodies capable of communicating in the same way as those muted, barely moving performers. Furniture was, for Burton, a special category of objects with which he had had a, quote, lifelong obsession, unquote. Built in relationship to the human body and its functions, furniture is, by definition, designed to reflect and to cater to the body of its user. In addition, tables and chairs could vary widely in styles of their creation, and Burton would bring out the class connotations of furniture's style, much in the same way his reductive behavior tableau prompted the viewer to attend to the often overlooked nuances of gender and body language. In 1973, he explained that the tableau and the furniture pieces had, quote, different materials, but with the same overlapping preoccupations with the human figure, with dream states, with social relationships, with sexuality, and with art, unquote. Now, this exploration of furniture in these performances, and in some related photographic works that placed sculpture out of doors, led Burton himself to make another transmodality, another medium shift, in which he started to consider making his own sculpture, this time furniture as sculpture. The transitional work in this development was Bronze Chair, first exhibited in 1975. When he moved to a new apartment on Thompson Street in New York, Burton found a discarded replica of a Queen Anne chair left by the previous tenant. It served as a performer in some of those early works, and eventually he decided to transform it into a sculptural object. It served at the same time as a conceptual portrait of its previous owner, one Ernest Cardinale, and Burton later called it a monument to this working-class man that he had never met, but who had occupied his apartment before him. Now, this work, the Bronze Chair, drew upon the literality assumed to be the central trait of the minimalist object. That is, it exhibits a similar directness and presence in the way it shares space with the viewer. Sitting directly on its legs on the floor, the Bronze Chair proclaimed its own theatricality. More so than any functionless metal box, the arrangement of bricks, or any gray plywood polyhedron, this work appeared, in fact, to be waiting for the viewer's co-presence to activate it. Minimalism's spatial and temporal self-awareness was understood to be won through the banishment of all representation and signification. That is, literalism was predicated on its total abstraction. Burton's Bronze Chair, by contrast, achieves an amplified relation with the viewer through the reintroduction of representation, signaled through its deadpan use of bronze. Burton first showed the sculpture at his exhibition at the Artist Run Gallery Artist Space in New York in 1975. His exhibition included an ensemble of appropriated chairs placed against the backdrop of a blue curtain. This work, the Pastoral Chair tableau, operated much in the same way that the chair drama had done, though this time focusing on one scene and the relations of figural objects within it. This was the only work inside the gallery, because outside, the Bronze Chair was placed on the sidewalk across the street. The Bronze Chair was not immediately recognizable as art in this context. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a discarded chair. Indeed, being New York, more than one person attempted to carry off this apparently abandoned treasure, only to be befuddled by the weight of solid bronze. As was relayed by one critic, quote, "The Bronze Chair is designed to be indistinguishable from any chair left outside, hence it is both utilitarian and garbage, according to New York slum habits," unquote. Thinking the object was merely such a piece of potentially utilitarian garbage, and then realizing, perhaps to some embarrassment, that it could not be a normal chair because of its material and because of its extreme weight, the person on the street would be forced to reconsider her or his expectations of public space, to face the frustration of their desire to possess that object, to ask just what type of thing they had encountered on the sidewalk, and to question what the function of this object might actually be. Significantly, in other words, Burton's first sculpture was, in this regard, also a public and social sculpture. Burton came to this important work by learning from minimalism's emphasis on the viewer's participation, while simultaneously critiquing its inhuman abstraction. From the mid-70s onwards, he increasingly explored furniture's familiarity and functionality as means to expand upon what he learned from the Bronze Chair. That is, first, and these are the lessons he learned from the Bronze Chair. First, the importance of that move into social space, and second, the redistribution of the authority from artist to audience. His goal was to create, increasingly, a kind of art that was less elitist and more, to use his terms, democratic or pluralistic. In other words, he sought to reimagine art so that it would have appeal and impact beyond the narrow art world, and increasingly became engaged with the idea of social and public space. In 1974, he stated, quote, "So far, artists have not produced new styles or any kind of art that relate to more than a small part of the rest of the people or that have any vital relation to the energies of the whole culture," unquote. Well, hand in hand with this critique of the art world and its exclusions, Burton was also developing a very different kind of performance work that similarly attacked from within the idea of the artist itself. In the mid-1970s, he made a series of works that parodied the authority of the artist and went after some of his most visible contemporaries. On the one hand, he was making these muted and self-effacing performances and objects. On the other, he was concurrently creating outspoken and explicit works that grew from his increasingly politicized foregrounding of his own homosexuality. He would later tell The Advocate, quote, "Maybe it's my gay identity that unites my performance and furniture work," unquote. Through his aims to make functional, social, useful, self-effacing furniture as sculpture, Burton was developing an alternative to the singular importance given to the artist as the source of meaning. At the same time, in his other performance work, he was launching an attack on that very notion. The work in which he first developed his critique of the authority of the artist was titled Lecture on Self. An early version was conceived in 1971, but it was fully developed in a performance on May 5th, 1973 at Oberlin College. As his description of the piece for the catalog made clear, he was playing with the artist as both subject and object. Quote, "In a solo performance of about 1 hour, Scott Burton will give an illustrated critical lecture on the performances of Scott Burton, who will then appear for questions," unquote. It was, in his notes for the work, quote, "a deliberately schizophrenic and critical piece," unquote. Now, the text that Burton read for this lecture, it's in the archives, in fact, does serve as a manifesto for his own unique hybrid of performance, sculpture, and theater. It's a very illuminating text. The straight talk of the lecture, however, gave way to a dramatic revelation of a performative alter ego as the climax of the talk. In an essay on Burton, the critic Robert Pincus Whitten described the event for us. Quote, "The artist dissembled as a clean-cut American, wearing a short-haired wig and a suit and tie, as if he were a young instructor talking about someone else's work. A blackout followed, and wig and jacket and shirt and tie removed, the artist was suddenly revealed in overalls, a conscious parody of the modern American male artist, with the phallus sharing importance with the overalls. I show here a subsequent staged self-portrait of this character. Here, Burton wears a set of high platform boots and overalls that have been covered with represented paint splatters. From the overalls, a rubber phallus protrudes prominently. With these elements, Burton pushed to the point of absurdity the supposedly heroic attributes of the artist. The overalls parody the cliché of the paint-splashed clothing of Jackson Pollock and the identity of the worker that had been adopted by the likes of David Smith and, more immediately, Burton's contemporaries Richard Serra and Robert Morris. The large phallus serves to mark the presumed masculinity and virility of the artist as creator, central to this tradition. On his feet, Burton wore these exaggerated platform boots. He called these cothurni, referring back to the high-laced boots worn by actors in Greek tragedy, as well as gesturing to the countercultural and gender-bending glam rock of the early 1970s. In their reference to a particularly stilted form of ancient tragic drama, the cothurni boots serve to emphasize the mock seriousness of the role that Burton played, making the character all the more absurd. In each of the elements, the signs of authenticity, authority, and power were overplayed, resulting in a buffoonish reversal of the stereotype of the masculine, earnest, and powerful artist. In the 2 years that followed the Oberlin performance, Burton expanded upon this character through a series of photographic portraits that reconstituted it, creating a mythic alter ego. The ultimate version of his caricature of the pre-epic modern artist exhibited whiteface and had a large mustache. Burton had used whiteface in his earlier works to reinforce the inhumanity of his performers in the behavior tableau and to imply a generic or typical condition amongst them. Here, however, its pronounced difference from the skin tone of the dildo protruding from the overalls could not help but raise the issue of race. And this was a concern that he was developing in his performance work of the 1970s, a critique of race in general. The artificial whiteness he adopted for this absurd display was a further element of his critical caricature of the bourgeois modern artist, and I think a reference to sort of primitivist justifications of the modern artist. Now, more broadly, Burton's hyperbolic parody of the artist as virile and masculine was developed from his engagement with the feminist critique of art and art history that was emerging strongly in the early 1970s. His friend Mac McGinnis recalled that, quote, Scott was a big supporter of the feminist movement, unquote. As Pincus Witten remarked in an interview with me, Burton was very much involved with political moves towards, quote, marginalized empowerment, unquote. In his performances of the earlier 1970s, Burton had subtly incorporated gender and sexuality as key areas in which dominance and submission were enacted in social relations. With the 1973 performance, he focused his critical attention on them more directly. Along with his friendship with overtly feminist artists such as Sylvia Slay, Burton also engaged with others articulating feminism within the art world. His date book from 1975, for instance, includes several instances where the pioneer of feminist art history, Linda Nochlin, is mentioned, though it is unclear whether these were individual meetings or public lectures. She was a main reference for him, and by 1981, he said, quote, Linda Nochlin is brilliant on contemporary body art and persona and that kind of stuff, unquote, implying that he was still reading her. His interest in Nochlin's work was part of his increasingly politicized view of sexuality. Burton, like many others at the time, saw in feminist critique a model for the gay liberation movement. He frequently discussed both as part of the same progressive agenda, and he often made sure to mention gay liberation in relationship to his work. In a published response to a questionnaire about the usefulness of art as a political statement, Burton lauded the women's movement and its attack on institutions and lamented that the gay liberation movement had, to that point, been less successful. The very mention of the movement against legalized discrimination towards homosexuals was significant and, in itself, a political act in the mid-70s. In this regard, it's striking that in 1974, Burton had convinced the artist magazine Artright to allow him to edit a special gay issue. It was supposed to be released in June 1975, but it was never realized. Nochlin agreed to write an essay on sexuality and art for the issue. Burton would later recall in a 1980 interview on this entire period saying, quote, feminism had been a wonderful influence on the art world, not only in New York, but all over the country, unquote. And cited this as part of this moment in which he was trying to blend feminism and the gay liberation movement. Indeed, his focus on the personalizing tactics of minimalist objecthood, reintroducing figuration, and moving beyond the rarefied spaces of the art world can all be understood as being informed by this progressive context. Now, Burton's expansion of his self-portrait of the mythic artist in 1974 and 1975 was also, importantly, fueled by a series of events in the art world that brought debates around feminism, the role of the artist, and authority to the fore. The lightning rod for these developments was the publication of a scandalizing self-portrait by the artist Linda Benglis in Artforum's November 1974 issue. Coming some 18 months after Burton had first presented his priapic artist character, Benglis's critique of the presumed masculinity of the modern artist has come to be understood as one of the most significant art historical events of the 1970s, leading to, among other things, the founding of the journal October. Benglis's controversial magazine advertisement was the last salvo in a series of artistic exchanges with Robert Morris over the previous year, beginning with advertisements and posters displaying Benglis and Morris in various kinds of hyperbolic presentation. These highly public images were underwritten by a series of collaborative works done by the two involving video and photography, and I show on the far right a detail of a 1974 to 75 work by Benglis in which she and Morris adopt histrionic poses with the dildo from Benglis's advertisement. These erotic Polaroids Benglis showed twice in 1975, first at a show in early November and then in Jeffrey Deitch's Lives exhibition in December. Again, this high-profile exchange post-dated Burton's analogous 1973 performance, but it no doubt spurred him to expand it in 1974 and 1975. At the same exhibition in which Benglis's Polaroids were exhibited in December 1975, Burton contributed a work called Dream Sex that incorporated two versions of the tragic priapic artist and took on both Morris and Benglis directly. In the form of a triptych, the center panel contained a handwritten account of an erotic dream that involved Benglis and himself double-teaming Morris. With this work, Burton joined their competition to create the most virile version of the modern artist, but he topped them both by casting their macho displays as his erotic objects. And I should point out, in the narrative, Benglis becomes male. Now that is, in a work that shared the walls with Benglis and Morris's Polaroids, Burton turned the tables on them from the perspective of his homosexuality to reveal their irony to be just one more kind of macho display to be critiqued and parodied. The 1975 Dream Sex piece can further be understood as a direct critique of Morris in particular. Burton's final version of the modern artist character, with mustache added, was created in 1974 and would have been created with knowledge of Morris's dress-up in, quote, helmet and sadomasochistic drag, unquote, as Maurice Berger once called it. And I'm happy to say that it's upstairs in the exhibition, so that's great. Burton specifically cited Morris's and Benglis's advertisements as the catalyst for his purported sex dreams. This account is a critique of both, for Burton seems to have resented Morris's adoption of the visual codes of homosexual culture in his advertisement. It would have been apparent to Burton, to Morris, and indeed to any viewers of the mid-1970s, that Morris's chains, collar, and other trappings partook of an iconography of urban homosexuality that became increasingly public in the 1970s. Burton called Morris's bluff and, in his narrated dream, treated Morris as the bottom that he and Benglis use. The dream ends with Burton fisting Morris up to the elbow. In essence, Burton had to make Morris a specific target in Dream Sex and its narrative because Morris's masquerade so brazenly drew upon the codes employed by the rapidly coalescing subculture of leather and S&M in the 1970s. In urban centers, the leather community became a vital contributor to a more widespread establishment of gay public life in the late 1970s, emerging as a major axis around which the increasingly communitarian and political priorities were forming. Like many in the 1970s, Burton saw S&M not as a deviant private practice, but as a viable mode of sociality and sexuality in which traditional roles were remapped. As is attested to by much unpublished correspondence, Burton was a member of this community. At one point in or around 1978, he even held for a time a job as a bartender at the Mine Shaft in New York, which opened in 1976 and soon thereafter became, quote, the most famous S&M club that ever existed, unquote, as one chronicler so lovingly put it. Just about everybody who knew Burton has implied a connection to leather and the S&M community in conversation to me or in print. Richard Kalina, for instance, wrote, quote, domination, protectiveness, and submissiveness were scarcely idle abstractions for Burton, unquote. In an interview with a professional colleague of his who wished to remain anonymous on this point, I was told that Burton's works were, quote, deeply marked by his masochism, unquote. Now, this association need not remain on the level of Burton's biography, however. He politicized it and thematized it in many of his works, as we've already begun to see. He would remark in an interview in 1980, quote, I believe in flaunting that stuff. I don't believe in hiding any of it. I mean, who cares? We should have a sexually democratic society, unquote. He continued in that same interview to speak of future work, saying, quote, I'd like to include things like S&M and leather life and sexual styles in performance work myself in the future, unquote. Now, I need to stress that Burton's affiliation with the S&M community grew concurrently with his development of furniture art and public art, and the former provided the necessary context for the latter in its mitigation of artistic authority and visibility, that is, in its exploration of the artist's submission, self-abnegation, and self-abasement. Burton did make explicitly political work that addressed these affiliations. This is most evident in his contribution to the groundbreaking Rooms exhibition at the abandoned school PS1 in Queens in 1976. This exhibition has been understood as a major turning point in the development of installation art and remains one of the key events of art of the 1970s. Burton's contribution is rarely discussed, almost never. He chose one of the closets of this abandoned school for his work. Closet installation, here it is, consists of a commercially available fisting dildo that pierces the center of an aluminum male symbol. Below, a legend reads, fist equals right of freedom. As he explained in the catalog, quote, the devotions were to homosexual liberation and R.W. Fassbinder, unquote. He was referencing the German director's recent film, which featured homosexuality, the title of which defies direct translation, so is, in English, referred to as Fox and His Friends. So when you Netflix it, go for Fox and His Friends. But the literal translation, Burton, however, exploited the German and reiterated it with the sex toy and male symbol placed directly above it. The political aims of this piece were overtly proclaimed in the catalog, while also signaling an allegiance to the sexual communities that Robert Morris had been caricaturing. Now, these works I've just been showing cover the same period in which Burton started to develop his sculptural practice. On the one hand, we have his cool and self-effacing performances and furniture. On the other, the overtly critical and sexualized works in a high key. The latter, however, are barely known in the published literature on Burton and drop out of the biographies and catalogs to his work from the 1980s. I should point out the exhibitions in which Burton showed Bronze Chair and Dream Sex were on at exactly the same time in December 1975, offering two very different views of his practice. There is, I would contend, a deep connection between these overlapping modes. Both attack the conventions and exclusions of the art world. By recovering their concurrent development, we can begin to understand the sources of Burton's public furniture and its apparent artistic self-abnegation. This context of the mid-1970s helps explain why he would pursue making works that one ignores, turns one's back on, and uses. In short, his subsequent development of functional furniture as sculpture is best understood through his gendered critique of the authority of the artist and his long-running interest in submission as a positive value. In fact, in the late 1970s, Burton increasingly found ways to bring these two modes of practice together, integrating a critique of gender and sexuality into his performances and sculptures. For instance, in his last major performance work, the 1980 Individual Behavior Tableau performed at Berkeley, he explicitly took as the themes of this work the display of sexual solicitation, aggression, and submission. The performer slowly adopted a number of poses that included various forms of relinquishing. For another section, he adopted various sexual displays. Burton said of this work, quote, "I don't make parodies, but I try to get the poses and the attitudes that I see in the bars, in the baths, and on the street. This work would be meaningless if its content were only my personal experience, so I have to deal with aggressive and passive in social relations, hierarchies within a group, and in sexual relations," unquote. Here's another one. Such attitudes towards the politics of sexuality informed the ways in which he understood and characterized his furniture as public, democratic, and accessible. For him, the self-determination of the viewer or user of his works was important, and the neutrality and typicality of his furniture was meant to open rather than foreclose possibilities for use and sociality. This goal of freedom, as he called it, was directly related to his political goals with relation to sexuality. As he once said, quote, "We wish to have a pluralistic society, people of all sexual persuasions," unquote. Burton's development of a mode of public practice is informed by this same need for equality and individual self-determination. He remarked in 1981, quote, "There's a displaced democracy in my work," unquote. His first major work conceived as social furniture, the 1979 public table, was such an incitement to discourse and equality. Quote, "It made a wonderful sense of community for me," unquote. Burton recalled when he first used the table with friends. Like his other furniture works, however, its origins as a product of Scott Burton, the artist, were less important than the actual uses to which it was put when he submitted it to the public. As Burton came to prominence as a public artist in the 1980s, the overt sexuality of his 70s work faded from view, no doubt to help him secure commissions from governmental and civic institutions. Nevertheless, it still remained a crucial denominator of his work's veiled figuration, as in the intimate relation of the two parts of two-part chair. Because I'm an art historian, I will indicate where the two parts are. So, all right. Now, throughout the critical record on Burton, this connection to sexuality is constantly alluded to throughout the 1980s, as when Hilton Kramer remarked in a review, quote, that Burton's work is, quote, "a variety of camp attempting to go straight," unquote. Or in 1987, Michael Brenson wrote, quote, "There is a dimension of Mr. Burton's work that is almost pornographic. It is there in the suggestion of friction between the two rectangular blocks of two chairs. It is there in the chaise lounge, which resembles a reclining figure that we are invited to lie on top of. Is there a relationship between sexuality and Mr. Burton's populism, unquote? Well, such hints and questions were answered in the final ensemble on which Burton was working at the time of his death in 1989. Robert Rosenblum called this work a sadomasochistic fantasy. With armoires as palace guards, the queen bench, and the slave table, this ensemble acts out a campy 50s-style scenario of dominance and submission. And in this work, figuration becomes explicit as the theme of that figuration is a melodrama of power and subordination. Now, overall, when we survey the multiple practices with which Burton was engaged in the 1970s, it becomes increasingly apparent that they were all linked through a shared investigation of power dynamics rooted in his increasingly political and critical understanding of his homosexuality as a resource for cultural critique. Ultimately, his object's solicitations of bodily engagements are not abstract or disembodied, but rather intimate. We sit on, settle into, perch on, lean on, and use Burton's artworks, turning our gaze away from them as we come into bodily contact with them. Such intimacy, however, was only made possible through his own self-abnegation and self-debasement as an artist, allowing viewers to ignore his authorship and turn their backs on his works of art. When placed into the context of Burton's earlier work and its explicit exploration of sexuality and social dynamics, however, such intimate and unforeclosed bodily relations cannot be seen as neutral. What I've attempted to do in this preliminary paper is to suggest a more complex view of Burton's development, attuned to the foregrounding of sexuality so important to his other works that coincide with his furniture as sculpture. The recovery of this context goes beyond mere revisionism for me, however. Burton's work also offers a case in which a position of marginality, here one of a politicized and newly emergent public community of homosexuality, was used by an artist as the source to develop a new mode of artistic practice in which the power relations between the viewer and artist themselves become remapped. Burton's democratic public art, in other words, grew directly from a perspective and a community in which self-denial could be a positive and desirable relation to an individual or to sociality more broadly. In this regard, Burton's chairs are not about sexuality in any way, nor is this their central meaning of these or the diverse practice he would develop in the 1980s. Instead, it was Burton's engagement with the social and interpersonal dynamics of his sexual community that provided the framework in which his version of a socially engaged, self-effacing public art for everyone could be imagined. Thank you.